I suppose what comes out most clearly, thinking about the three of them, is, in a sense, it hasn't been something that we've brought out fully, but the whole question of the relationship between the structures you're operating in and the space that gives you to pose particular kinds of questions. Ellie talked about the importance of the 2010 Equality Act providing a space that allows you to go into schools in England and legitimately raise the kind of equalities and diversity education. So that's a really important policy space that gives you the possibility to pose particular kinds of questions. The contrasting situation that Michael raised is a situation where the particular nature of the structures as a result of the Good Friday Agreement and the power sharing agreement is such that it mitigates against any shift in policy. Mm-hmm. And the situation Michael's characterised is one in which hostility to LGBT communities and we would also add to women's sexual autonomy, women having control of their own bodies, is equally shared on the Protestant and the Catholic side of the divide. And given that the way the situation is, the structures are set up to allow both the Protestant political leadership and the Catholic political leadership to define the agenda, there's no space within that agenda for women's or LGBT issues to be raised, except in this sideways way of using public health. It provides this kind of small space in which organisations like yours are sort of fearlessly and heroically operating. So I really think this whole question about the relationship between the sort of policy area of education and the pedagogical possibilities is really a fundamental question. When we were organising this seminar, myself and the other members of the Feminist Dissent Collective, one of the things that really emerged quickly was, how difficult it is to talk about these kind of questions. It's hard to talk about religious questions in schools, and some of the presentations in the first half of today's workshop really showed that a lot of the discussions around religion are very schematic and textbook based and not connected to lived reality. It's hard equally to raise questions of sexuality in the face of the sort of relentless heteronormativity. Now that's very strongly embedded, I think, in conservative religious cultures. Not religious cultures inherently, but conservative religious cultures, and I think that came through from Mandeep's presentation about Sikhism, but I think also Michael's presentation about Catholicism and Protestantism in Northern Ireland. So the question of the way religious groups are able to frame and constitute policy really is a key question that I think we need to think about. So I suppose they're my sort of really key thoughts, really, that in a sense it's really important to talk about the pedagogy of how we raise those things, but before we can talk about that, we have to have a structure that legitimises even that space. So the question of policy is really, really important. I think the second question is the way organised religious groupings are very effective at shaping and influencing that structure. And the situation in Northern Ireland, as Michael has described, is really quite entrenched. It's very hard to see how you can change that without some kind of external intervention, really, of a policy-based nature, such as the Northern Ireland Executive being forced to do something which would then create a space for the voluntary sector and political movements and activists to emerge as actors more effectively in the situation. So that's really where I'd like to kind of leave my thoughts there. Yeah, just really to be, for us to be so aware of how the policy agenda is being shaped in across the UK at the moment. Yeah.
Should we take a few questions? I'll take one or two and then.
I just wanted to address the point about the policy environment and pedagogy, which is kind of at the heart of the thing, and say that the kind of pedagogy that you're talking about, that we need in schools from teachers, about openness, about inquiry, social justice, and personal journeys, I don't think that's just a policy environment shutting that down. When I left teaching, I left it because I didn't want to do SATs with 6-year-olds. And all the people like me have left teaching because we don't want to be that progress fundamentalism, I would call it. All the music teachers, all the fun people trying to get out. And that's the reality of what our schools are. So we can come in as NGOs and consultants and everything, but the day-to-day reality is that the e-backers come in, people won't be learning about disco because they're busy signing up to do subjects that will be academic enough for Michael Gove. So that to me is the fundamentalism that we need to fight. It's not just a religious policy, but actually it's a much more fundamentalist view of what childhood is for what growing up should be about, shutting down of personal journeys of teachers, the personal journey of becoming an educator, saying, all teach first, everything, you go straight into the classroom so you can learn to manage behaviour, manage children, rather than go to university and study how learning works and have your own theories of education and go and practice those in the classroom. So there's just been a completely fundamentalist environment, and I think that should be addressed here, as well as you could say the more obvious religious fundamentalism that might shape the policy environment.
Yeah, much in the same tone actually. I was just going to say that when the Equality Act came, I remember we were I was at that time associated with a BME policy organization, feminist organization, and we were doing these little write-ups and quickly sending it out all over the country to BME organizations, saying, "Oh look, you one of the criteria," and that's how you argue. So I appreciate, and I use that. We all use that in the sector as a tool to get in. But exactly what Eliza, exactly what Eliza is saying, that what it becomes is I almost struggle with it because I use it as a tool, and then I feel like what it does to the schools is they have this one form where they tick everything, and it's bizarre. The last time I went into a school, and much as we all know how hard it is to get your foot in, okay, I will go in at anything you ask me to do. And the last a head teacher told me, "So have you heard of speed dating?" I said, "Yes." "So can you do like a speed dating sort of session? So we have like literally the year 8s coming in from this door and getting out of that door, and you have 40 minutes and you do a session on healthy relationships. 40 minutes, and it's like, you know how it works, right? It's like speed dating. So the children come in, before they've finished their names, sat down, and then and these are schools where a lot of the students didn't even speak English. They were struggling. So each table had a teacher who was constantly, translating. So it's bizarre, like the sort of, that's what, much as, so their box is ticked now. They've done what is required because all of the year 8s have been trained in healthy relationships. So, much as I appreciate so also really creatively thinking in our sector. And I had one question, just maybe my ignorance, because when we go into schools, a lot of times there has been a debate over the term sexual orientation versus sexuality. And I personally feel more comfortable using the term sexuality, only because I feel that is, for me, or where I have had these discussions, we've often argued that sexual orientation makes it as if like you have to have an orientation towards something, whereas sexuality is who you are. But I may just be ignorant, so I would like to hear what everybody in the room thinks.
Yeah, sexual orientation would be who you're attracted to. Sexuality is the nature of your attraction. Your sexuality is you as a being. That's how we would see it. Your sexual orientation is gender specific. You can get into polyamorous if you prefer, or you know, there's millions of sub-definitions, but we would say sexual orientation refers to the person that you're attracted to sexually. Sexuality is you as a being.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
So sexual orientation is sort of more political? Is it?
Everything in Northern Ireland.
Oh, sure.
I don't know. Sorry, I have always wondered. I just wanted to hear what everybody thinks.
Yeah.
Did you, unless you had a quick comeback on this last thing, would it be okay to take another question that's related? Okay, maybe we'll take your question and then allow you to, yeah.
Well, it's on this issue of sexual orientation, and that was going to be my comment / question.
Oh.
Everything that's been presented has got, I think, a slight issue. I mean, obviously we're all right on here, but there is a slight issue in that orientation is being spoken of in quite an excluding way. You're talking about sexual orientation is about the gender that you're attracted to, but we have research now that shows that sexual orientation is actually about the sexual self that you're born with, whatever that is. So it could be that you're born a paedophile. You can't help it and you shouldn't do anything about it in terms of practicing that, but that is your sexual orientation. Or you are born with a kink fetish orientation, or you are born homosexual, or you are born heterosexual. Now you may go through journeys, you may challenge it, change it, and all of these kinds of things, but there is research that suggests that whatever our orientation that we live with, it's not actually that fluid. So I think it's important to appreciate that sexual orientation is not just about are you heterosexual, are you homosexual. It is much, much wider. So that's the first thing. And then I also think that once we start to speak in this wider sense of the human as very possible in so many different ways, there's a bigger game that can be played, a much more flexible, powerful and political game. So take Northern Ireland for example. I'm pretty sure, just out of guesswork, that a lot of the people that are repressing the homosexual community have a sexual orientation which is not, that they're not out with, but they are doing things in their private lives which I would identify, if they told me what they're up to, as a kink orientation. So you've got people who are presenting as straight, oppressing people who have a different gender specific interest, but they are actually very other. It's just that it's the narrative that they give to society that's determining how they can sort of play a power game that hurts other people. So in a way, the question is, in all respects of what we're discussing today, is the most powerful thing, apart from consent obviously, because that is so important, but is it about outing again and again from the silences that circulate all the time, and they are so hard. It is so hard to not be silent in some way, shape or form, because you can't say everything at every given point, but the silences are there because we have a specific way of being with each other. And if we used a pedagogy that just allowed a freedom, then we would learn that freedom was the currency and the language. And we could just talk, rather than talking against or responding against or telling people how to be and so on and so forth. So it's a paradigm shift I'm wondering if we need.
Sorry.
Just for me, just recall that there's this, and then before we would want to forget these other questions about the policy environment, education environment, and neoliberal assault on schools and education of all kinds. I think, I don't know if you want to connect them or go back to the earlier questions.
Yeah, we can tackle them all. There's a lot though.
There's a lot there.
There's an awful lot there.
Yeah,
By the way, there is tea and coffee. I don't know if anyone wants to get a refurbished, like,
Should we do it in 5 minutes?
Yeah,
maybe
try and
so then bring our coffee.
okay, because there are other questions
Yes,
to come as well.
of course.
Maybe we can have some sort of brief response.
I'd like to say a little bit, were you wanting?
I'll go whenever.
Okay. I would just like to say something about policy and legislation, because I've been doing work based on various Equality Acts and the Equality Act for 20 years in organisations, and I really see policy and legislation as a double-edged sword. Now, of course, that's with the privilege of having them on our side. So I completely take your point about what you said about Northern Ireland. But from where I'm sitting, policy and legislation have a very, very long shadow in organisations. The tick box thing is a symptom of people's fear of being wrong and guilt about having been wrong being shoved down and then manifested in these, well, come and do a bit of consultancy for us and we've done our bit for equality. And I think the reason why there's a shadow is that both policy and legislation identify what is and is not okay. So the fact that policy and police come from the same roots sort of says something to me, which is that people feel policed by policy and legislation. They repress the things about them which are not supposed to be okay. They have this political correctness culture. The word politically correct didn't come from the progressive side. It came from the reactionary side to discredit everything we're trying to do and make people afraid. And because they're afraid, they behave in perverse ways. And those perverse ways mean trying to look like you're good when you're not. And that's what almost all of our industry is based on, that guilt reaction. And so that's my salary, and possibly yours as well. And we still go in, we try and do something good there. That's the point. But the space is structured by a collective psychology of guilt and fear. And to turn that around, for me, is spiritual work. Because when I'm in the room with somebody, I want them to be a human being in the room with me, not the manager, the chief executive, whatever. I want them to really realise that this diversity thing is about them and about their shadow. But it's not always easy to put that across, and there are so many different styles of doing it. But there is a very long shadow, and the fact that you rule out things, anti-bullying, anti-discrimination, bad, where's the good? Yeah. Where are the relationships we're trying to create between children? Are we going to get to a point where people will be afraid to open their mouths because they might say the wrong thing and they might be bad? And that's the problem with policy and legislation. It's not the fault of the policy and legislation, it's how we metabolise our shadow that is problematic. And all of our work has to address that with joy and enthusiasm, or with analysis, or whatever it is, with science, whatever it is, but we've got to get in there and help people not be afraid to surface the stuff that they won't talk about.
Ellie and Michael, I think you both want to respond.
Yeah.
Also.
There is absolutely no doubt that every school, as you're saying, completely has its own ethos and own agenda. And you feel, I feel it each time I go into a different school. It's actually very tangible. As soon as you walk in, you can feel what the ethos of that place is like. And I spend a lot of time connecting with that and trying to find the areas in. And it is much easier when you have a head teacher that is beautifully on side. And I totally understand your point. I feel that every single day as you were speaking. It's like, hey! And that is, so many of my friends have left the teaching profession, and we are in that horrible neoliberal world. The schools are becoming free. They are free. They're free markets. They can do whatever they want, but they still have to follow the Equality Act, and they still have to follow the Ofsted criteria. Fundamentally, that's what they are following. So as much as they might want their target-driven crazy places, I feel like now I'm walking into businesses, and that's a really horrible thing. I mean, some of them actually look like a sauna as I'm walking in, and there's like people with headphones sitting on the, like, I was like, have I walked into Canary Wharf or something? No, this is a school. This is a school with the community that are taking part. Why are you making it look like this? So the whole space that you were talking about does not reflect what's happening within that space. So there's an absolute mismatch of what is happening out in the community that is actually happening in the school. So that's my first thing. The Teach First thing, I've worked with Teach First, I have to say, and I do find the concept of it quite a difficult one politically, because they will only have young people that are Oxbridge graduates who have achieved a certain level, and putting them into very difficult schools. So, realistically, they are young people who have no experience of working in that environment. So for me, I don't see how that works. And I think generally a lot of the time it probably doesn't, and not many of the graduates even stay in the schools. It's a very low percentage as far as I've
conversion
been
rate
told.
is- The conversion rate, there's a huge dropout rate after the first year and then even more after the second year.
Right.
to run Ofsted though.
Well, that was the next point. I know we talked a lot about
They leave
Ofsted.
schools and they go into Ofsted.
Yeah.
They set up academies and then they go and run Ofsted.
So there's that fast tracking thing once you're in, and it's like schools being run by managers, not by teachers, and that is a real problem. You know, Educate and Celebrate, I only employ teachers because they have the experience and they understand teachers. You know, that's my ethos. I'll do it, but I've got so many things. The sexuality thing versus sexual orientation. I always use sexual orientation because for me, sexuality is with how sexy I'm feeling. You know what I mean? I always think it in terms of that sexy thing. But sexual orientation is like, you know, it's like who I'm actually attracted to. So I've never used sexuality as, I would never use it as a term for what I do at all, because it just doesn't connect with me and what I'm trying to get other people to understand. And it is that bigger picture. I totally get where you're coming from. But there's other questions.
And you unusually put a plus.
Yes.
And good for you.
I think on paper, what you're saying about the sort of, you sort of rejected fluidity, which was quite interesting, because I actually think we are all heteroflexible, really, or homoflexible, or whatever way you want to look at it.
Keynesian scale.
I do think it's, you know, a sliding scale, but on what you said, it's on paper. Because I'm very dubious about using statistics, like 90% of people identify as heterosexual, but I think they just do that on paper, because we're so bound by the restraints of, no one's mentioned capitalism yet, can I be the first person? Like, I know it's probably the wrong, but it is, our lives are better if we are heterosexual and we live with a partner, it's cheaper. And you know, there's all these other things that we are bound and constrained by, that we are trying to smash. So I understand it. I do think people are repressed because they're brought up and socially conditioned. I was chatting to teachers last week, they're older teachers, and they were saying, but this wasn't even an option for me when I was growing up. It wasn't an option that I could be a lesbian, or I could be trans, or I could be, you know, it was never suggested to me. So I didn't.
But the fluidity thing is that they're not fluid to reject their true self. So
You're,
Oh, right.
saying people were born with an orientation.
if someone's born with it,
right.
they do not have the fluidity to reject that nature.
Right, okay. Yeah.
I just, with the first point, obviously from a Northern Irish context, our teachers subcontract things that they're not comfortable teaching. So they get external agencies to come in and do RSE. All of those external agencies are Catholic organisations. And they provide, you could not make it up, I swear to God, guys, they're called Love for Life. Okay, and they will come in and they will provide with DVDs and resources, and they will come in and they will sit down and they'll be like this clear white page. This is one of the programs, I've seen them demonstrate this. This is you whenever you're born, white and pure. Every time you have a thought.
What about Ham's original sin?
Well, exactly. But they basically turn up. They turn up and then screen it back out, and it's like, that's you going to your marriage. Now they're sitting with a bunch of fourth years, year of whatever that is, in an assembly style, so nobody can even argue with them. And that's what they do, and that's how people in the teachers don't have the time, haven't been trained, don't have the resources. The amount of pastoral care that they have to take on is huge. So what they do is this external organisation will come in and do so much more damage than anybody else could do. So yeah, I totally agree. And with the business thing. But the other thing I wanted just quickly to raise was, if we could all self-identify, it would be amazing. But we can't, because we need to have a group to lobby. And I don't think we should automatically go, that person's oppressed, that's why you hate the gays. No, you might just do it because of your religious beliefs.
Yes.
We have the tried introduction of a conscience clause to ban goods, facilities and services to people who are or can be seen to be in a homosexual relationship. That was legitimate legislation that was tried to be brought in 2 years ago. The gay blood ban, adoption rights, marriage equality, any type of equality legislation that has been brought in the north of Ireland has come through the judiciary. It's come through the courts. No legislation, all through the courts. And that stems from the fact that the biggest party there is based around a church. an evangelical right-wing Christian church called Free Presbyterianism. And every single member of the DUP, bar one, who happens to be the first leader, or the first minister, Arlene Foster, she's Church of Ireland. Every other one of them is a Free P. That's where that comes from. So I don't think it's repression. I don't think it's gays hating gays. I think it is actually their religious fundamentalism affecting social policy, and that's why we have the separation of church and state. And that's why I have an issue with schools not being accountable with regard to their curriculum and how they impose it. Because I work with young people every day. I see their self-harm scars. I've seen their suicide attempts. It's horrendous. And that comes from invisibility, because the powers that be will not even recognise you, never mind engage with you. How does that make you feel as a person? How am I as a person whenever you won't even acknowledge I exist, never mind give me the rights that my brother or my mother or my father or my sister has? So what do? You turn to the internet. You turn to to get answers, because nobody will tell you the answers. You turn to internet, and the internet provides extremes. And people complain, it was brought up earlier about gay people being promiscuous and having this notion that gay people are promiscuous. Do you know why that came about? It's because we can't formulate relationships when we're growing up, because we have to hide our identity. So we're bad at them. And then we go out and have loads of them, because we need to work out what everybody else who is hetero or normal, as people describe it, were able to do whenever they were 13, 14 and 15. We don't get that option. Yeah. So
I see you want to make a quick
I
point.
just wanted to ask about the school inspections, because what made a difference here, you did mention Ofsted, because we got criteria in 2012-13 that said schools had to be inclusive. This is regarding a government policy. Is there not Ofsted criteria, your school inspectors? How come that it hasn't gone through that way?
doesn't apply.
The Equality Act.
The Equality
But
Act
who are
doesn't
your
apply.
school inspectors? Ofsted?
No.
Who inspects the schools?
Well, if it's a Catholic maintained school,
Yeah.
they're funded by the church.
There isn't. It's just a different system. It's a total.
So there's no school inspectors?
I think they have internal inspections and they produce reports, but I don't think it's from an external body.
Okay.
It's not supported by the Equality Act, so it wouldn't do what you wanted.
But
it to
Ofsted,
do.
but they're external from all of that. They're external organisation that come in and judge your schools, you see. So I'm just wondering where that is in Northern Ireland.
No, they produced legislation to say that certain things should be taken into account,
Yeah.
and inclusive and stuff like that, but it wasn't applied.
So it got
That's-
taken out.
It was never there in the first place.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether it is a question, but maybe it'll turn one. And my thinking is still not kind of formed, so I'm kind of thinking aloud as I'm speaking. And I really want to go back to what you said, Razia, because I thought some of the things you said are so extremely thoughtful and also extremely valuable. What sticks in my head, I've also written it down, how can a school cater for the young people that you described? And then your rules. I think I only caught 4 of them. Don't be afraid to ask any question, even if you think they're stupid. Become aware, or be allowed to become aware that you're not alone, and have an awareness of the history of your questioning. And I really like that thought, put your own beliefs to the test in the fire of other people's questions. I think these are extremely valuable ways of going about what you asked, and that is to nurture and nourish. And I use those 2 words very deliberately. As it were, what we understand to be the spiritual side of the person, whether it's a young person or an adult person. And as you were speaking, I was thinking that actually the young people you described would fit sort of in the world that I am investigating into this category of other. Yeah, it's not a good way of as you were speaking about things, but we understand what it means. That's why I'm raising it. And I was thinking when that thought came to me, that if we as teachers at whatever level find a way of educating young people or not so young people to find the right approach and the right attitude to this other, it doesn't matter what the other looks like, because it would encompass, as it were, all sorts of varieties and possibilities, you know, all the shapes and sizes that people can come in, and I don't mean just their physical selves. And I was also thinking that it's not just important to allow the young people to have these things addressed, also the adult people around them. And I think that's where we go back to the neoliberal atmosphere that we're all living in the schools and otherwise, but also in the training of the adults who are teaching, because, you know, some will be of the generation where these issues just simply weren't on the agenda. You know, where pastoral care wasn't part of the education that they experienced, let alone, you know, anything about the relationships or, you know, what we call the softer skills in life. So I think all that needs to be brought in. And actually for that spiritual side of young people, we do have a curriculum niche, and that is the social, cultural, I always mix it, a social,
SMSC.
moral, that's right, a social, moral,
Yeah.
cultural and spiritual development of young people, which is an obligation of each school. And I think within that curriculum time, there are possibilities. And I will finish with just an experience from a project that we finished, are still working on. One of the findings is, and it chimes with a previous project where that has also kind of chimed from the young people's comments, that what they really value is when they have, as it were, structured times in the school day, where they can speak freely, when they can articulate their own views, hear the views of their peers, but they have an adult moderator. They wouldn't call it that, but they have an adult in the room who kind of makes sure that things don't get out of hand, and where some things, you know, like bullying, teasing, whatever, are not tolerated, and it's understood that that is not. So in other words, it allows them to have a platform to try out ideas, explore areas, but also they get feedback, and then they can go and maybe address some of the questions. So I don't know whether that was a roundabout question or just a reflection on what you said, but I found it extremely helpful also for myself to hear you speak along those lines.
Yeah, just a quick comment, sorry, about what Elizabeth said. PHSE is not mandatory any longer in secondary schools. Just to
Although the association is
yeah, the association is there. It's very titular now. So I'm just poor with. I was in fact trying to find it on my phone, but I couldn't. I'm sure we can look up. There was a consultation done by the government last year because you know, the Violence Against Women Coalition had done this whole campaign to say that we need PHSE back, and we are ready to have a discussion and, you know, sort of reinstate it in whatever form, you know, at least have that mandatory. But so the government did a consultation whose report came out last year, and it's bizarre again. I mean, I can't remember how to, sort of, I've read it, but I can't remember what date or who did it. And that said, that categorically justified why the government feels that we do not need PHSE. Again, you know, lots of Ofsted and everybody. I mean, the Ofsted head having gone to a school where she was one of the only 6 pupils. You know, I mean, again, the whole sort of privilege around, you know, looking at these things, looking through the lens that they are. So, I mean, I'm sure we can. So, yeah, PHSE not being mandatory is a big issue.
But I'm talking about SMCS, which is spiritual, moral. SMSC. Sorry, I always mix them up.
That's all right.
Right. But, you know,
Okay.
having had a project on it, and I still can't get it right. But that's separate. That's not within the PSHE heading.
Sure, but I thought you were talking about PHSE
No,
somehow. Sorry,
no.
my
That's
ignorance.
okay.
But
That's
also
okay.
that, I mean,
Yeah.
I think to also bring forward the issue that PHSE is no longer mandatory and what that
Yeah.
means to schools
Yes.
and curriculum pressure and to teachers and every one of us.
And did you have?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that in terms of spaces, youth work, I mean, I know that it's been cut, and but talking as an ex-youth worker and someone who has gone and worked in schools, and find it really, really difficult. And, you know, if we're going to talk about capitalism, you know, the function of schools is a very oppressive system for young people. And so there are pluses and minuses to working in schools. One, you've got a captive audience, but two, you've got a captive audience, you know, and so giving people a space where they can actually be themselves, think about things together, you know, obviously the best youth work practice, that's what that is. That's what. And so, I mean, I guess people here are more into, kind of into more formal education as a group, but informal education is really, really important, I think.
The loss of youth work.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, I know it's just gone so much, but that's where, you know, like the voluntary sector is just really, really important.
Well, that's effectively what I do for Rainbow, and did do for Brooke, is solely community based. Now that's down to obviously the structures that are in place where we are not allowed to go into schools and discuss this, for whatever reasons that we've already gone over. But I mean, I'll go into a youth club and there'll be 27 boys, and every single one of them is shaking with anticipation because they need to ask me questions. Nobody's ever discussed it, nobody's ever done it, and nobody will, you know, and that's why that and to undercut the funding for that is going to be so devastating. There are cycles of poverty which are perpetuated through lack of knowledge and patriarchy, and that just continues, and they just continue to take the money away and take the money away and take the money away. And I find it fascinating that we have to go through a medical model where education is concerned. I have to do stats about how many chlamydia tests I do, or how many emergency contraceptives we give out, and that's monitored on a monthly basis, so we get our funding for Brooke. We have to see how many rapid HIV tests we do. We have a rapid HIV testing service, by the way. But all of that is compiled on a daily basis and sent off. You're on a knife edge with your funding. I was talking, there's about near 50 streams of funding that come into our organisation. We have like 10 full-time employees, and everybody else is part-time or a volunteer who give us their time. And that's the only way we can function as an organisation. So.
You said you had 27 boys. What about the girls? And I mean, presumably the people that don't identify in between, but as the other main body, where are the girls? Are they
The
going
girls
somewhere
never
else?
kind of get as excited as the boys, but yeah, that's as girls are. I find that there's a bit more maturity with girls with regard to their bodies, and they don't have that emergency, that need. And you can start off a bit slower with them, build a contract, do stuff that you normally do. It's not as immediate as where the young guys it's myth busting for the first 45 minutes. I'm going to write a book someday of some of the questions you ask.
Well, that's because of pornography.
But
And
it's
the availability and the
completely-
access that
We spend
young boys have compared to young girls.
The last set of statistics for where I'm from, the average age that a young boy was exposed to porn was 9. That's the average age. Isn't that ridiculous? Like, and they internalize that over time, and then it snowballs. So you're just spending your time unpicking all of that. But that's because there's a lack of education and truth around this issue, and then people turn to alternative sources of information, and then they sensationalize and internalize this American, overly produced, ridiculous notions of what it is. So the fact that relationships are so decreasing in young people, you know, it's like, are you in a relationship? No, but I am seeing somebody. Okay, so do you spend all your time with them? Yeah. Do you see other people? No. Do you really like them? Yeah. Are you having sex with them? Yeah. But you're not in a relationship? No. How long have you been seeing them? 2 years? It's about making that jump. So this work needs so much put into it, because with the prevalence of social media, smartphones, the instant communication, people aren't forming those bonds. They're finding it very difficult in that developmental stage to even have that, to know what a relationship is. It has to be redefined for it. And that is where youth work is imperative, and there's no money for it.
But it's also the peer culture, you know, how as it were, I mean, the American word is hookup, and it's one of the most
Mate.
one of the most sort of
vague words you can imagine, because you can subsume anything you want under it. But most of the time it's extremely casual, it's extremely short, and it's simply for the sake of having status in your peer group. I mean, I don't know to what extent this is applicable to our context, but there's this book I brought along, The Sex and the Soul, and this is a study about campus life in America. And this lady, the author, Donna Freitas, she's done both interviews and a survey at different colleges across the US. And she found that the young people were dying. I mean, the way it started was that she had a conversation sort of off topic in one of her seminars. And the women, they were all young women in this seminar, they started talking about this hookup culture, and she realized that they wanted to get away from it. So she then deliberately made space for them to talk about it, and then they started, broadening this out. And then she thought, I need to find out more, and then that's why she did this survey. And it's so interesting because also again the context is important. You have Catholic colleges, public, private ones, and then the public. They are sort of in one pot, and then you have the evangelical colleges in another pot, where you think it's different. Yes, it is different, but only on the surface, because the same thing goes on, but their rhetoric and their statutes and, as it were, their obvious culture, apparent culture, says that it doesn't happen. So I thought it was fascinating to read about this, but also about the pressure that young people are exposed to. They don't want these casual relationships. What they actually want is, your straightforward, romantic, boy meets girl, or boy meets girl, whatever, but sort of develop a relationship and then have a lasting relationship that is ending in some sort of couple, family, whatever scenario.
We've actually undertook research to talk about the notion of peer exploitation within peer groups of young people being forced into sexual situations, the likes of lineups, which are horrendous. And you can do your own research because I'm not going to go into it. But young people engaging in the first time they've ever had a sexual act with somebody else, engaging in it, basically they're forced into it. It may not be with the person that they are orientated towards or even have any type of connection with at all, and they're forced to do it almost like a rite of passage. And we have found clusters where these are taking place, and the damage it does is horrendous, because you're messing with people on so many levels, and it's really bad. Bernardo's did some fabulous work on peer exploitation, really good stuff. It's horrible.
I mean, in London, that would also come under the gang culture. I mean, especially young girls and women being exploited within. Well, I mean, the gang itself is an abusive context, an oppressive context, but even so, more about the young girls, how they are sexually exploited.
Yeah.
And of course, that's horrific.
So just I just wanted to go back to that previous question. That would you think that you said that the girls are not so sounding so much in a need because they are more capable of dealing with issues? Would you?
No, I didn't use the word need. I said they weren't
you said they
eager.
are more mature.
They weren't as eager.
Not quite
There wasn't as much
so
energy in the room.
Yeah, but I wonder whether they are rather more shy or suppressing their expressions purely because of the gender identity, which is common. I mean, because I work for a community women's organization, and it's similar, not very different what you are doing, but very similar, that to make the women, and when we make this real space for speaking, then they really do speak out. And I wonder whether it is the control, the cultural control, the social norms, and religious regulations as well, put this pressure on them that they don't want to speak up to the extent that they need to.
No, I think you have as much interaction with, but if I do a lot of puberty talks with both girls and boys, co-cultural mix of people, or we would separate them out if the energy in the room's spiking, just to try and talk to them individually and then come back. There's as much interaction with the girls as there is with the guys, but I think if you're talking to girls about puberty at a certain point, they're more aware because there's a practical implication for their bodies. So they may have had that education before, as where you have to sit down with the boys and explain what maybe the girls have already been told by a family member or by a teacher, or in that context. Same, you know, that kind of way. So, and depending on where they are developmentally, they may know everything that you're talking to them about. So then you move on to other subjects and you get that energy in that. It's that I don't think that they wouldn't engage as much. I think they just have a bit more education than the guys do beforehand, depending on where they kind of are developmentally. So that's kind of what it was, you know, coming from. But it's more about myth busting and tackling subjects that have not been tackled before with guys, if that makes sense.
Also, the girls are probably likely to talk more amongst themselves, where the boys won't.
Well, they were talking about periods predominantly, and developmentally they tend to develop before guys. Guys develop puberty-wise a little bit later, so they, you know, have had that conversation. It's not always like that, but sometimes it can be.
Can I just ask a quick question to Razia? You said, going back to the point about girls wearing headscarves and rebelling against parents, with that research, how far did you get with those
Not
girls?
as far as I would like to have done, but I had very, very interesting conversations with them, because this is the PhD research we're talking back in 1990. And these were young women who were at college, studying for they were over 18, so they must have been, in the first year of something, post A level. And basically their take on Islam was just very, very, this was just in the wake of the Salman Rushdie affair.
Right.
So these were women who were aware, unlike when I grew up, which was kind of 20 years, 10 years earlier, they were aware that being Muslim was something. And something rather important in the world. And so they had taken it upon themselves to investigate, what is this Islam? What have my parents been telling me? And they decided what their parents had been telling them was wrong. The parents were influenced by cultural norms, and that they hadn't read and they hadn't studied the religion, and they had reverted to, they called themselves reverts, and some of them were wearing hijab and some of them weren't. But their thing was really about that Islam was wise and their parents were not. And that in the wake of the Iranian Revolution was very important, because I grew up in a family where we were very aware of geopolitical issues, of neocolonialism, of all of that, and we were kind of basically an anti-imperialist family. Well, nobody really succeeded in kicking the pants of the US until the Iranian Revolution came along. All of a sudden Islam was on the map, and I remember my older brothers particularly the brothers, feeling that being a Muslim was something really good in the world. Well, these girls were, in a sense, slightly younger, but the female equivalent of that. They were going, well, we've got our lives ahead of us. What are we going to identify with? And they're drawn by the call of Islam rather than by socialism or feminism or anti-racism. That didn't mean anything very much to them. But here was a whole system that could tell them how to live their lives, that gave them dignity as women, that gave them a sort of equality, because if you really read into Islam, that's in there as well. So it's the whole deal. And a relationship with God. Oh my goodness. So then I also have a relationship with the mystery that draws me on and gives me a purpose in life. It's so complete. So this is what I was getting from them. They were a bit younger than me. So I was in my 20s and they were in their kind of 18, 19.
Right.
And it was so fascinating for me, coming from a very liberal Muslim background, where when my father married for the first time, he instructed his wife not to wear burqa.
Right.
She was not allowed to. She had to wear a sari. She was not even allowed to wear shalwar kameez. That was, my father was so like, that's so backward. You're not going to do that. So I grew up in that context, and then meeting these girls, that was so, for me, so interesting, and maybe
There
that.
is research. There's research that backs you up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not just in Islam, it's also, for example, you see it in the Sikh community that all of a sudden you find young women wearing the turban. Absolutely unheard of.
Yeah.
It's wonderfully captured
It's
by
amazing.
Hanif Qureshi in My Son the Fanatic.
Yeah.
You know, where it doesn't turn out to be this kind of utopia of, you know, finding equality and
No.
finding God. In fact, it's a new form of
But it's a step on their journey.
no, a
I
new
think-
form of oppression.
Yes, but
I
You
would
know?
say so.
I think the
yeah.
impulse is important. It's a step
Yeah.
on their journey of liberation.
Yes.
And I had to learn not to judge that.
Yeah, yeah. of
So
course.
I was kind of quite involved with Women Against Fundamentalism and stuff like that. And I realised that that whole discourse was so they couldn't relate to that discourse because they were not being related to. They were looking for a liberation.
Yeah.
And this was part of their journey. I don't know where they are now. They might be
Yeah.
in a totally different place.
Yeah.
But they're young people, and they have, you know, they're making themselves. And I don't think it's ever too. We never stop learning. I don't
Yeah.
feel like I've kind of landed somewhere and I'm a feminist and that's the end of it. I'm sort of like that's only the beginning. You know, that's just only the beginning. I did the very first wedding. I was saying this to somebody earlier. As an interfaith minister, newly ordained, I got a call from somebody who asked me to do their wedding, first wedding ceremony I got asked to do. A Muslim woman asking for a nikah from an interfaith minister. I nearly fell off my chair and I was terrified. I thought, my goodness, I'm not a really good Muslim. I'm not, what about the Arabic? How am I going to pronounce? And I thought, hang on a minute, what's going on? And I'm a lesbian, right? So and I had to tell her to come out to her. I said, you sure you really want me to do your wedding? She said, now I'm even more sure that I want to. She's marrying a black Caribbean man.
Oh, taboo of
Right?
taboos.
Her family has rejected her, but she wants a nikah.
What does that mean?
I have to, a nikah is a Muslim's wedding ceremony. So I conduct an interfaith wedding ceremony with a nikah in the centre of it, with very, very few Muslims in the gathering. So I have to explain, not only conduct the nikah, but explain what I'm doing. This is me, like somebody who's like not been brought up to do this at all. And it was a very interesting journey, which was absolutely a most amazing experience. I would do it again 10 times. But they had to have the police because her family had been threatening her about this because of her marrying a black
all
man.
the partners, she
Yes.
chose the one that's at the bottom of
So
the
she's
list.
got an upstanding member of the Muslim community
Yeah, it doesn't
conducting
really-
her nikah. And what was interesting is that a couple of women came up to me afterwards, Muslim women, who had had arranged marriages. And they came to me and they said, I never understood what my nikah was until today. We never stop learning. We never have to stop having the opportunity if we're willing to stretch ourselves. That was a big stretch for me. I sweated to do that thing. Also from a spiritual point of view, because I had to be aligned to do something. It's not just a job. It's a vocation to be a minister. It's not an easy thing to do. But when that woman came to me and said, when I married my husband 11 years ago, nobody explained to me what I was doing. And now I understand what my nikah was about. It made the whole thing worthwhile.
But it goes back to what I said earlier, the access people have to actually the theology of their own faith tradition.
Yes.
There are things that, that's close to them.
Yes, and this is the right that we have to inquire.
Yeah.
Who are we? Where have we come from? What is my route? What is my path? Where am I going to?
Let's take just a couple quick. Did you have something?
I was just saying to that in a way, it's mention of Scott Atram's work on fundamentalism and how the jihadi tending people that he's spoken to are saying in one way or another that all they're doing is just looking for some meaning in life.
Yeah.
And that's maybe what your young women were saying.
Yes, and if they have wholesome forums in which to do this, they don't have to do it in a way that harms other people or themselves.
Yeah.
That's why this work is so important.
Abby, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick on that when we do open these conversations, because we were talking about that's how you started off the session after coffee, which is about how do we cater for all these different types of students and what do we do in the classroom. And I just sort of wanted to give you a few examples of conversations that do happen in the classroom when you are given that safe space to be able to do that and what the changes are. We've just evaluated we've done a project with the DFE this year, so we've just completed our evaluation. There are 3 things which come up all on the spiritual sides that taps into what you were just saying. So the students were given a platform to talk about God. This was like in one of the schools, year 5s. Right. So year 5s were given that platform to discuss what God is, and you touched upon this earlier on, what does God look like? And you talked about that earlier. I thought it was really, that's what made me think of it. And then I just found out the bit of text which said, someone said, God's only son came down from heaven to save us from our sins. Fair enough, good comment. So the student said, God's son is a boy. I said, well, yeah, Jesus was a boy. He was human, but God isn't human unless you think of him as God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. So we dissected that a bit, and they said, well, he always says he's about God. Is he a he? And I said, well, do you think? And there was a bit of banter, and then someone said, he's omnipresent. And I said, yeah, that's excellent, he's omnipresent. But what is he? I said, we are he. We can't call him he, we call him it. And someone asked, is he not gender specific? Is he gender non-specific then? Is God gender fluid? And this was a conversation that's been dictated, been like completely, and it was just so brilliant. And that's from a year 5 class. So that conversation was
philosophy for children though, in what they were doing? Was that
P for C, yeah. So that came out of a lesson that was observed by Goldsmith through our evaluators. So they went in and found that. Another story that I saw was an LSA. There's an LSA in one of the schools who in primary schools we read books about different families. So it's like very straightforward, Mummy, Mama and me, or the Tango makes 3. So 2 male penguins hatching an egg, so that sort of thing. And the LSA noticed all this going on. LSA was Muslim, and so was learning about what we were doing, how we were doing it, and there was parents' petitions outside. And this LSA, because they'd experienced what we were doing, had first-hand experience about what LGBT inclusion is, could very happily then went out on the streets to talk to the parents that were protesting outside, to have conversations with members of the community. And I love that kind of thing of our communities coming together and learning. I just thought it was a brilliant moment. And then my favourite one was a year 4 lad went home, dad not happy that we're doing Muslim family again. Dad wanted to called a family meeting and got all the family around going, I'm not happy, sent the kid upstairs while they had the family meeting. And the family decided, no, the kid could not join in with these lessons, it was awful. And the child just came down and said, Dad, they're just teaching us about treating everyone equally and fairly. They're just teaching us. It's the same law that protects lesbians, it does that protects us as Muslims. And that's coming out the mouth of a young child. So what these hashtag moments of change are happening every single day, and the more of those we have, and those because we just keep talking about the space and the safe zone. Everyone keeps mentioning it. I think it's brilliant, and it is. And when you do have those conversations, that's where we do move things that little bit further forwards.
I think that's very interesting, because I don't think people realise that homophobia affects everybody. It affects straight people. Straight people walking down a corridor in a school will get called all the same names as somebody.
Thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, and so it's a rot that we have in our education systems that needs to be removed for the benefit of everybody.
Because as it were, the LGBT plus community isn't, as it were, without prejudice either.
Yeah.
Because
we're full of prejudice.
Sorry, I'm not trying to be personal.
No, it's actually true. We have a lot of work to do within our own communities, a lot of work, and
I'm grateful that you say that, because sometimes I'm part of something and I just feel the negativity coming from somebody, as it were, from that community towards me, kind of assuming to know where I am. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, give me a chance.
I think as a community we have a tendency to be hyper aware, and I think that stems from just general protection, safety of yourself. You're hyper aware, you're conscious of yourself. I know how I sound. I've been clocked before for my voice. Do I augment my voice whenever I'm in certain places? Yes, I do. Do I hold my partner's hand whenever I'm walking down the street? No, I do not. So that's my daily lived experience, and I am very conscious of it and very aware of it. So that I do totally agree with what you're saying, and I know of instances where people have overreacted, but I think that comes from learnt defensive mechanisms, which is, I'm not saying it's right, but You can kind of understand bits and pieces.
I don't know what to do because I think we need to wrap up, but I can see there's lots of hands and, what should we do?
I
Do we need a kind of summing up or not? I mean, I don't know. Or
I
just
think we need to be out of the room by 4:30.
Yeah.
Oh, that's 3
5
minutes.
Yeah.
Maybe
We're supposed to
another-
finish at
I'd say a
4,
very,
weren't we?
very short thing, because the hopeful message
Yes.
in what you're saying
Yeah, I want to.
is that homophobia isn't fixed forever.
Yeah.
You know,
That's a nice
actually,
thing.
don't be afraid. If you can talk in a space where you're not going to be killed, actually, people can change.
Yeah, that's what I found.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they
We do
change
every day.
most often if you
Yeah.
just say something very direct and very simple to them instead of wrapping it up in lots of anger
Yeah.
and judgment and criticism,
True.
like the child saying to dad.
Yeah.
And actually, it really works.
Yeah, on a very basic level, I say, well, I grew up in the 70s and we used to call each other spouses and mongs, but we don't use that language anymore because we've been educated about disabilities. We don't use racist language because we were educated about it at school, but we have not been educated about LGBT at this moment in time, and that's the problem. So it's about increasing that visibility and making sure this is on the agenda and every single day.
Okay. Can we stop there?
Yeah.
Seems a good place to stop. Hopeful message.
No more questions.
Do you want to keep coming up or not?
Yeah, sure. Just a quick summing up. It would be, I think it's really useful to get some suggestions from the people here as to what kinds of things would be of practical use, as well as what kinds of further discussions we could have. And of course, there are also the virtual online pages of our journal, where I think it would be really good to have a forum on this topic, so that it can reach a wider audience.
Sorry, I just have a really positive thing.
Yes.
All of the kind of progressive work in the schools that are done within the areas that I work in are done by the pupils themselves.
Mhm.
They go out and they set up gay straight alliances and they bring
Yes.
it to, and it's something, and they get given time and places to go and meet, and they create their own information for their fellow pupils. It's an amazing thing that they do, and I know of about 3 of them that go on in the greater Belfast area. So that's something.
Right. Very positive. Stephen, did you have to?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I want to say is really, I think the richness of this story is really demonstrated by all the contributions people have made. And I think this really shows the importance of the journal Feminist Dissent. There are very few organisations that will tackle such controversial issues as all these questions about the relationship between religion and sexuality. And so I think, Feminist Dissent is being launched for the first issue in a month's time, and it is going to be a space, we talked a lot about space, it is going to be a space where these kind of controversial but absolutely necessary to be talked about issues can be talked about. So please talk about that and share that information to everyone you know, and use all your networks to talk about that. I mean, I think this is, this has been, I suppose in a sense what's emerged from me is there's a kind of tension in our discussions between what you might call an interfaith approach or a secularist approach. The approach of Feminist Dissent is more on the secularist side, but we as Feminist Dissent also see a need to have dialogue with with people who are talking about interfaith approaches, because they are talking about other ways of seeing religion which are opposed to fundamentalism. I think that if you link that in, this is where the difficulties of talking about these come. If you link that in with the question of sexuality, you can see, and all the contributors have brought this out so well, and I really thank them for that. But the whole question of sexuality sits in the domain of the political and the sort of rights domain, but also the psychological, the emotional, the spiritual, in the sense of wholeness. Yeah? And so I think sexuality is itself an incredibly complicated area, which is hard to talk about on its own, let alone in relation to other things. And I think what's linked to that with our discussion of education is this whole need of I'm using Razia's phrase here, a pedagogy of nourishment and nurturance. I think that is, Elizabeth, was it Elizabeth's phrase? I think this is really so fundamental, and I think we see this space for this pedagogy of nourishment and nurturing enclosed by, on one hand, religious fundamentalism, on the other hand, the sort of neoliberal instrumentalisation of education. So this space is precious and must be defended. And I think one of the things that's come out of here very concretely could be, it seems to me, a campaign to reconstruct and argue for PHSE education across all schools. I mean, I think the question of academisation was raised because the academy schools, many of which are faith-based, can opt out of PHSE, and that's going to have really detrimental education in the future, implications for the future. The question of Northern Ireland and why that is able to opt out of that must be put on the agenda for progressive educators right across the UK. We can't allow this to be seen as something that doesn't concern us, and I think that's it is a real problem with the progressives in England, that we sort of treat Northern Ireland, we on one hand we grabbed Northern Ireland and made it part of the UK, then we treat it like it isn't. Do you know what I mean? So there's a kind of whole political...
Irish,
there's a whole political
Depends on who you ask.
So I think that's something really concrete that could come out of this, could be some kind of campaign to reconstruct, not just to go back to it, because a lot of the points people have made have talked about the inadequacies of it as it was constituted. So let's rebuild that using the insights that people have talked about today, and make a political demand about the reconstruction of that. That's a demand that could be taken to teacher unions. That's a demand that could be taken to parents groups, young people's groups. Let's also not forget about the important point that Heather raised about informal education as well. So I'll sort of leave it at that there, yeah? But I think there's a sort of concrete demand there if we wanted to find some way to be thinking about that.
Great. Thank you.